Told ya. I can't make this up. This is the life of the rabbi. This is why it actually took them 40 years to get out of the wilderness, which happened in this week's Torah portion. Ay, ay, ay. So everybody heard what I said, but it's not recorded for posterity. So all of those words of praise that I said for Adina and Abby and Liam, I meant them, but no one will ever have proof that I actually said them. Pretty cool. Now, I've seen these kids, and there are others. There's a Sternberg and a Zaltak. There are so many kids from our congregation that have graduated this year. We send them on with our Mazel Tov, with our hopes for Ruach and Koach. And yes, and now it's being recorded. I do owe all of them pomegranate puckers, which I have. So if anybody needs a pomegranate pucker tonight, we have the new pomegranate puckers for this year. So, Shabbat Shalom. It is awesome to be able to be here, to be with our community, to be able to share and teach. Our Torah portion on this Shabbat is Shlach Lecha. And Shlach Lecha is beautiful. It's incredible. It's the story of the 12 scouts or spies, one from each of the tribes, that are sent to the land of Israel. They're here in the wilderness. They send out the scouts. The scouts come back. And what do they bring? Giant grapes, right? One cluster is carried between two men, giant pomegranates. The fruit of the land is tremendous, but the people of the land are tremendous too. We're like grasshoppers to them. 10 of them freak out and get the people freaked out. And 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, say, you know what? We can do it. And it's in that moment God says, look, if only 2 of you are ready for this and the rest of you aren't, fine, you'll all die in the wilderness. Your kids will be the ones that will go into the land. So you have this whole dynamic in the Torah portion of community of people following the wrong influences. And that led to a commentary that I came across from one of my colleagues, Rabbi Lori Reishi and her husband are in Nashville, Tennessee. They were with us in our Israel class many, many, many years ago. That were 25 years that Jill and I were in Israel, which is really hard and incredible for me to believe. And I came across this commentary, and it struck me, and I'll explain why, because basically she writes, I sat with one of my congregants, a beautiful, smart, funny 12-year-old girl who told me about the social challenges she was having in school. Because she was beautiful and smart and funny, some of the popular girls didn't like her, so they started a campaign to make sure that none of the other girls in class would talk to her. It was a very bad bullying situation. And she writes, she talks about ta'amod al dam ra'echa, don't stand in your fellow's blood. And she says, what strikes me is more disheartening than the 2 mean girls, right? There were 2 girls that instigated all of this. What was more disheartening, the actions of the other girls who simply followed suit like lemmings. How many of you have heard of lemmings? Okay, what do lemmings do? They run into the sea. How many of you else have you heard that also? Okay, so
other lemmings off the cliff.
They follow other lemmings off the cliff. And isn't that the problem of Shlach Lecha? That the people of Israel, 2 of them are like, you know what, we can do this, we can go forward. And the other ones are just like a pack of lemmings throwing the people of Israel off the cliff. They're so afraid of the future, we might as well just die here in misery in the wilderness. Just like the lemmings. Sounds good, right? Don't be a lemming. But there's a problem. Because when we say don't be like a lemming, we're actually part of a really bad, horrible, destructive lie. Lemmings do not jump off cliffs. Lemmings do not jump off cliffs. Lemmings don't commit suicide. Lemmings migrate. Do any of you have ancestors that migrated, that they were in a place where there were issues of economy, there wasn't enough resources or too much population or something like that, and your ancestors moved? That's what lemmings do. Wouldn't you know that, in fact, Norwegian lemmings are brilliant? The lemmings of Norway, in fact, when the population density gets too high or there aren't enough resources, groups of them gather together in sacred community and go off into the wilderness on a journey to find a place where they are able to be sustained. They do jump into the sea, but lemmings can swim. Why do we think like Cantor Keel? I did too, by the way, until last week.
There was a computer game in the 1990s that told me that the lemmings jumped off the cliff.
She learned it from a computer game. I learned it from, I think, a weekly reader, okay? That, in fact, lemmings jump off cliffs. Do you know who taught us that lemmings jump off cliffs? Disney. Disney taught us that lemmings jumped off cliffs. They had a documentary in the 1970s called White Wilderness. It was filmed in Canada, and they wanted to show about wildlife and mass movements. But in fact, they thought lemmings were kind of boring, and they needed something a little more exciting. And so instead of, remember I mentioned the whole migration thing is a Norwegian lemming thing. They filmed it in Canada. They used Canadian lemmings to talk about the Norwegian lemmings. And it gets worse. Why do we think they jumped off a cliff? Because we have video evidence of lemmings jumping off a cliff. Do you know why we have video evidence of lemmings jumping off a cliff? Theoretically to their doom? Because the camera left out the truck. What truck? They put the lemmings in the back of the truck. They paid a Canadian Eskimo guy $1 a lemming to gather lemmings. They put them in the back of the truck, and they filmed the video. They showed a cliff, and they showed some lemmings on the cliff, and then they showed footage of the lemmings falling out of the truck. Disney cooked it all up so they would have a great story to tell about how stupid and how silly and destructive the lemmings are. It is a complete fake. But look what happens we get that story that Disney told us in order to sound really good, and because they know human nature, right? That we'll look at the dark side of nature, we'll look at the crisis, we'll look at the destruction. They knew we would buy into it. But in fact, that's not what it means to be a lemming. We want to be lemmings. I will tell you, after hearing this, I heard it first on John Green Anthropocene Reviewed. If you want to listen to his podcast on the lemmings, it's even kind of darker than that because he explains it into a movie, and how we humans will sometimes not only push each other to find the most negative portrayal of each other, but we will do it to nature too. But also just Google lemmings and page after page after page outing what Disney did so many years ago. On this Shabbat, as we send our high school graduates, I hope everyone's Googling this now, as we send our high school graduates into the world, as I look out at our congregation, as we've just crossed a sea of reeds in so many ways. If you think about this pandemic year, we are in that stuck and narrow place. We don't know where we're going. We just know we got to keep moving forward. We have to keep moving forward. We're getting to the end of that tunnel. We want to be those lemmings, because that is what the people of Israel did at the shores of the sea. We don't want to be Disney of the 1970s, right? Do we want to be the worst, to make people and look for the worst in the people in nature? Do we want to invent the worst to make ourselves feel better or to stroke our own ego? Think about the stories in the Bible where this happens. Korach, right? tells that story about Moses and how awful Moses and Miriam and Aaron are. The 10 spies here in Shlach, the Tower of Babel. We see that side of humanity on display. How many times, in order to build ourselves up or to get where we're going, we will put energy into demonizing or diminishing someone else to prove ourselves right, to get ourselves forward. That's not healthy. That is not humanity. That is not Kedusha. It's not holiness. As we talk about Shlech Lecha, as we think about how are we going to move forward towards a land of milk and honey, towards a future full of promise, I hope that we find our inner lemming. They're little fuzzy rodents, by the way. They're kind of cute. Because what do Caleb and Joshua do and the lemmings do? They acknowledge the fear and the concerns of others. Right? What did Joshua and Caleb say to the people of Israel? Yes, we felt small too. We know we're coming as a ragtag group of mixed multitude out of Egypt. We've been wandering in the wilderness. We feel like grasshoppers. That's part of what they say. But Caleb and Joshua, they say, look at the fruit. Look at the fruit of the land, what we have that opportunity to get. And then they say, look at our strength. Look at our success. Look at how well we've been able to do. Whether it's the Lemmings or the people of Israel, whether it's our community, let us be like Lemmings. Let us find ways as a community. When the world gets tough, what do we need to do? What are we called to do? To band together, to forge a path together. That's what those little rodents do. It's what our community does. Rather than looking for ways to break each other apart, let us come together to walk, to swim, to jump, to find those ways as a community collected together to move forward to that place of shalom. Amen, and Shabbat Shalom. And remember, be a lemming.